Hello everybody, welcome back. We are talking about the three primary measurements within macroeconomics: GDP, inflation, and unemployment. In the last video, we finished up GDP and we were talking about nominal GDP versus real GDP and how real GDP helps to account for the change in price levels over time in order to make accurate comparisons. And so that brings us directly into the idea of inflation, and we're even going to use one of our measurements of inflation as the GDP deflator, or the implicit price deflator as it's sometimes called. So in this video, we'll look at a couple measurements of inflation, and then we'll finish off with a little bit of discussion about real versus nominal interest rates before moving on to unemployment and the labor market in the last video for this chapter. Okay, so let's dive in. The inflation rate generally we can think of as the percentage increase in the price level. Okay, and we're going to look at two different calculations of this among many, but we have the GDP deflator and the more commonly used CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. There are others. There's a Producer Price Index, and a couple others, but we're going to focus on these two. They're the most common, and the CPI is the measurement used by a lot of the governmental agencies in the United States in order to adjust prices in things like the Social Security program. So let's dive in first with GDP deflator, tying in from our last video where we talked about nominal GDP and real GDP. So the price deflator is just the division of these two. Nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Okay, and the inflation rate is, again, just the percentage increase in the price level. So we can say, let's just say deflator instead of GDP deflator, but deflator during time period t over the deflator in time period t minus 1, all minus 1. Okay, that's one way to do it. I'll just show you one other way really quickly. You could do, instead of t over t minus 1, just equal to the deflator, the difference of t minus the deflator in t minus 1 over the original deflator in time period t. So this last one I like to call difference divided by original, but it's actually, this first one is a little bit easier to calculate and a little bit more straightforward to get used to. So I'd recommend the first calculation, but these are identical to each other with a little bit of algebra. Okay, so we saw in our last video that, and I think this should be a 6. We saw in our last video the calculation of nominal and real GDP, and then looking at the calculation of these things here, we're going to use them again and just look at the inflation rate. So the GDP deflator in the base year is always really easy. It's just 1, right? Nominal GDP divided by real GDP is equal to 1 in this case. Next one, 2001 GDP deflator. Nominal GDP, let's do nom divided by real for the deflator, is equal to $600 divided by 350, and that's going to come out to 1.71. Okay, so the GDP deflator here is 1.71. And I'll just let you guys do the next one. You can maybe pause and try it. Once you're back, the answer comes out to 2.42. Okay, and so next we're calculating the inflation rate. We don't do it for the base year because we have nothing to compare it to. We have to have a difference in time in order to calculate inflation. So if we're looking at the annual inflation between 2000 and 2001, we take the difference divided by the original, or 1.71 over 1 minus 1. And that's our first formula up here. So 1.71 over 1 is just equal to 1.71 minus 1 is equal to 0.71. So the inflation rate during this 1 year period, it was 0.71 or 71%. Okay, and again, I'll leave you to try the second one. Once you do, you should come out to pause the video if you need to. The answer to that is going to be 42%. Okay, so give that a try, but that's how you calculate the inflation rate using the GDP deflator. Okay, nominal over real GDP. That's just a quick little section. We're going to focus more of our time on the consumer price index because it's the more commonly used measurement. Here, we're thinking about a cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. So in the actual calculations of CPI, they're thinking about how much do Americans typically spend on food, housing, transportation, energy, so on and so forth, clothing, restaurants. And then they just look at the change in these goods and services in their price levels over time. An easy way to think about it could be on a more simplified level is you go into the grocery store and you have an actual basket. And in that basket, you put a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, a bunch of bananas, and let's say a bag of chips and some salsa. And you fix that basket. In every, say, month or every year, you go back to the grocery store and you put those exact same items in the basket, and then you're just measuring the cost of that basket over time. It just happens to be at a macroeconomic level. The basket includes the purchase of significantly more goods and services. So all of that with the same idea here. We'll go through the steps. So the first one is to fix the basket. So that, in our simplified example, is set the basket, put the gallon of milk, the carton of eggs, the bananas, the chips and salsa, and fix that so that it's not going to change over time. In reality, the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, uses surveys to figure out what is a representative bundle of goods and services purchased by the average American. And then they update this every 4 or 5 years. So you fix the basket, you then find the prices, compute the cost of the basket, and then once you have the cost of the basket, you can compute the consumer price index. And again, you're using a base year. So just as you do with real GDP, anytime you're trying to look at price differences across time, you have to have a base year. So consumer price index is the cost of the basket in the current year divided by the cost of the basket in the base year. Cost of basket in base year. So that's going to give you an index, which is just a number. It doesn't have units, but an index to compare across time. So if in one year the index is 100, and in the next year the index is 102, the index has increased by 2%, right? And so you would say that you had a 2% rate of inflation. So the index, again, just a number. If it goes down to 98 in the year following that, you could say the 2-year inflation rate is minus 2%. So again, it's just a number. Oftentimes indices start at 100 and go above or below 100, and that makes it really easy for percentage change calculations. Okay, so you compute the index, and then finally, with the index, you can compute the inflation rate. Compute the inflation rate. And this is just the same type of calculation as it was for the GDP deflator inflation rate, but here we're just using CPI. So CPI in time t over CPI in time t minus 1 in order to get a 1-year inflation rate minus 1. Okay, and again, you could also do the other formula, the difference divided by the original, but this is just kind of generally easier. So coming back to our ice cream and pretzel example, here we're going to have our fixed basket. Now, unlike before, where the quantity was changing and we let the price stay the same, which is what we do with real GDP. Real GDP prices stay the same for the base year and the quantities change. Here, we're fixing the quantities and letting the prices change to compute the inflation rate. So we're fixing a basket of 50 ice creams and 10 pretzels, and then we're using their respective costs. Okay, and so really quickly, I will put our deflator inflation rates, which we just calculated. Those were 71% and 42%. But now if we're fixing this basket, 50 ice creams and 110 pretzels, really quickly, let me just show you the first computation of that. In the year 2000, the prices were $2 for ice creams. We're buying 50, plus $1 for pretzels, and we're buying 100. Okay, so that comes out to 200, just as before when we calculated real GDP. Cost of the basket in 2001. Here, now we're letting the price change, and the 2001 price was $3, but we're fixing that 50 ice creams and the $2 and fixed 100 pretzels, and that's going to come out to 350. Okay, and so I'll leave the third year for you to do. Let me just refresh you on the price if you don't have it from the previous video. It's $4 and $3. So you can calculate that. Okay, but then once we do that, we're getting our inflation rate. Remember, these we already calculated with the GDP deflator. We use the same formula, the CPI. Let me just write out the formula so you can see it in action. CPI in the year 2001 over CPI in the year 2000 minus 1. So t is 2001, and t minus 1 is 2000. And so we just get 350 over 200 minus 1. Throw that into a calculator. You get 1.75 minus 1 is 0.75, or 75%. Okay, so again, last one is for you to try. But as you can see, if we're comparing CPI calculated based on the GDP deflator and the CPI, we don't get the same inflation rate. And that's pretty common, especially throughout the kind of last 50 years. Over the last 10 years, kind of during the decade of the 2010s, inflation calculated either way was approximately the same at about 1.7 per year. But if you go back, 50 years or 70 years, but a significant time period, typically the inflation rate calculated through CPI tends to be higher on average than the inflation rate calculated with the GDP deflator. And so in this next section, let's talk a little bit about why that could be the case. Okay, there are generally two categories we're going to talk about here. The first is substitution bias. Substitution bias. Okay, and that's because we have a fixed basket. So if we go back to this idea of the little grocery store basket, we had a gallon of milk, carton of eggs, bananas, and then chips and salsa. So if the basket is fixed and the price of bananas go up, ultimately we're trying to measure the cost of living. But if the cost of bananas go up by a whole bunch, I could maybe substitute away from bananas to apples or oranges or some other produce in order to get my fruit. And even though the cost of the fixed basket has gone up, my cost of living has not, because I substituted away to a product which is not in the basket. So this could be true at this micro level, but similarly on a macro level with the real data, if say the cost of gasoline goes up by a whole bunch and you live close enough to your work or school to switch your mode of transportation from say a car to a bicycle, or if you're able to walk, it'll look like the cost of living for all of these people have gone up drastically, but some people might have substituted away to a different mode of transportation that isn't as energy intensive. So their cost of living may not have increased, even though the CPI fixed basket would have shown that it had the cost of living in the economy has gone up. So substitution bias is the first one. And then the second one is increases, or let's say improvements, in quality. Okay, and here, let's use this example of a Honda Civic. So a Honda Civic in 2015 versus a Honda Civic in 2010. Suppose the newer Honda Civic is $24,000 and the older one is $20,000, so a $4,000 difference. But again, it's very possible that we're not making an apples to apples comparison. It could be the case that the newer Civic has a lot of new improvements, safety features, maybe a touchscreen GPS, fuel economy, all sorts of additional features that were not included in the 2010 Honda Civic. And maybe if you put in, the side airbags and a new GPS and a bunch of other features, in order to make the 2010 Honda Civic identical to the 2015 Honda Civic, maybe by adding all of those features, this could have cost, who knows, $22,500, right? And instead of the cost of the car increasing by $4,000, maybe it's only gone up by $1,500 if you account for all of those other features. So again, if you don't account for increases in quality, it's going to look like the cost of living has gone up, but now maybe you don't have to buy a couple $100 GPS to include in your car. Instead, it's already built into your car, as one example. So improvements in quality is another reason why the CPI might look like our cost of living has gone up, whereas it might not have actually gone up that much. Or we've had quality improvements which aren't accounted for through that CPI as well. Okay, and so the last part of this video here, let's talk a little bit about why this matters and a brief discussion of interest rates. So why does this overstatement of CPI matter? Particularly in the United States, this first category about Social Security benefits. Every year, people on Social Security receive a fixed income, and so let's call it $2,000 a month. Okay, but if we have had average inflation a little bit less than 2% per year, if the cost of living goes up by 2% a year, then the Social Security Administration adds 2% to the payments for those on Social Security and federal pensions. Okay, but if they're calculating those extra payments to be 2% a year, but in reality the cost of living is only going up by 1.7% per year, that overstatement of inflation means that every single year the government is paying out 0.3% more than necessary in order to maintain the same standard of living for these people on fixed incomes. So that overstatement is just extra monetary cost that isn't, it doesn't necessarily need to be spent. It's just extra money in that way. So that's one. And the second, which is less common in the United States, but labor contracts that have built-in wage adjustments called COLAs, cost of living allowances, these also can hinge based on something like the inflation rate from, say, CPI. And again, same thing, if the inflation rate is overstating the true cost of living increase, then these programs are paying out more than they need to. And that has a lot of implications for kind of their long-term sustainability. Okay, so overstatement of CPI, overstatement of inflation using CPI has been present over kind of a very long period of time, less so in the more recent history, but definitely has pretty substantial fiscal implications. Even if it is only something like 0.3% over decades, that can compound into a huge amount of money spent through the federal government. So last thing here, because it's using the consumer price index, any inflation is really only thinking about the cost of living from the consumer's perspective. It doesn't include anything bought by government or firms. And the GDP deflator, because it deals with the entire economy, C plus I plus G plus net exports, this would give a kind of a broader increase in the prices and kind of the inflation for the entire economy, not just for consumers. So that's one more implication when we use CPI as our kind of default and primary way to calculate inflation in the United States. Okay, and then the last bit here are inflation and interest rates. So just as we have nominal and real GDP, we also have nominal and real interest rates. Typically, when you're seeing rates posted online or at a bank, and so forth, they post the nominal interest rate. Or if you're getting, say, a pay increase this year and they say, congratulations, your pay is going up 2% this year, that's most likely a nominal interest rate, not corrected for inflation. And so the real interest rate does correct for inflation. It's simply the nominal rate, nominal interest rate, I'm just going to put nominal rate, minus the inflation rate. And a couple abbreviations we use for this, or some, the way we denote this is R is equal to I minus pi, which we'll come back to later. But the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus inflation. And this also has some substantial implications depending on the context. A very common example is in your own personal bank account. Suppose you put a $1,000 deposit into your bank at a rate of 10%, very high for today's rates, but assume a 10% interest rate of 10% annual interest rate and a 5% annual inflation rate. So what's the nominal and real amount of interest earned after 1 year? The nominal rate is just the $1,000 times the 10% interest, which is equal to $100 in interest. The real rate, you take the $1,000 and you have to take the nominal rate minus inflation. So that's going to give us a real return of 5%. So $50. Okay, and so in these two ways, this you actually end up making $100, but we can think about the inflation and the interest rates as the real increase in purchasing power. So yes, you made $100, but because inflation has been 5% over the last year, your $100 can only buy you what you could have bought with $50 last year. And so inflation decreases purchasing power over time. Right? So if there was a TV, if in year one, there's a TV that costs $100. Well, let's say the TV costs $50. In year one, you could have bought 2 of those TVs. Right? In year 2, you can only buy 1 of those TVs because it's $50. The price of the TV has gone up to $100. That's kind of just one way to think about it, but ultimately, inflation is decreasing your purchasing power over time. Okay, and so real interest rate tells you how fast the purchasing power of your bank account increases over time, the buying power of your currency, and again, for something like your annual wage increase, if the inflation rate is equal to 2% per year, and your raise is equal to 2% per year, your real raise is equal to 0, right? So you made 2% more per year this year, but everything costs 2% more. So in your purchasing power, you actually have no difference between this year and last year. So that's a consideration. And then something on a policy level is thinking about the federal gas tax, which hasn't been changed since the early 1990s. And I think it stands at about 18 cents. I think it might be 18.4. So if that was passed in the early 1990s and we've had approximately 2% of inflation per year, we've actually had a real decrease in the federal gas tax. So the purchasing power has changed over time, that the tax makes up an even smaller amount of our consumption and expenditure because the tax hasn't increased at the rate of inflation. Okay, and so again, a number of different considerations here, whether it's through policies or wages or interest rates at a bank or interest rates on an investment account. You should always consider inflation and subtract inflation out from the rate over time. And again, we'll talk later about monetary policy, but the target for the annual inflation rate is it's not about 2%, it is 2% in the long run. And so the Federal Reserve targets an average of 2% inflation per year. And we're going to talk a lot more about that once we get into some more information on monetary policy. Okay, but that's going to do it for the inflation component of this chapter. The last thing we have to talk about is the labor market. And so we'll talk about the primary measurement of the health of the labor market, which is unemployment, as well as kind of a couple implications there, and a couple other ways to measure the health of the labor market aside from unemployment. So again, we'll get into the details of what's included, what's not, and a couple other ways that we can think about labor market health. Okay, so that's going to do it for this. We will jump into that in the next video. See you then.